hitting back to one of the top stories of the day, as we did just play out some remarks from the attorney Mark Garagos as he spoke as President Joe Biden pardoned his son Hunter late last night in a move that we brought as breaking news to you here at Live Now from Fox. I'm going to bring up some more video of Hunter Biden as we continue on this conversation. The Associated Press here reporting that Biden pardoned his son Hunter, sparing the younger Biden of a possible prison sentence for felony gun and tax convictions and reversing his past promises not to use that extraordinary power of the presidency for the benefit of his family. Now, the pardon not only covers Hunter's convictions in Delaware and California, but also any other offenses committed from January 1st of 2014 to December 1st of 2024. Let's get a full breakdown on what this means and really all of the news that's coming out of this decision. So joining us now, we have a political analyst and historian, Rich Rubino. Rich, always good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
All right, Rich. So this story really gaining traction, of course, because we heard time and time again that the president was not going to do this, was not going to pardon his son. What do you think changed from the moment that we heard those comments previously to now?
I think certainly if Vice President Harris were to be elected, he probably would not have gone down this road. I think the fact that Donald Trump has been elected president, the fact that Kash Patel, who is seen as somebody who would probably be very adversarial, would be in charge of the FBI theoretically. I think that Joe Biden saw that, and he saw that this was the only way that he could potentially save his son. So that's why he kind of went back on his previous word, even though, usually when politicians say something and oftentimes they mislead or they say a technical truth, but there's a little bit more of the story so that they have a little bit of room to get out of it. But in Joe Biden's case, he made a categorical statement that he would not pardon Donald, that he would not pardon his son. His press secretary essentially did the same thing, but I think that it was probably the fact that there would be a Trump Justice Department coming up, and they probably on their vacation at Nantucket, he probably made the decision he'd be willing to take any potential political excoriation he might get in return for the fact that his son will be avoiding prison time.
I've been reading some reports, Rich, some people questioning the legacy that President Biden is going to leave behind based off of this decision that he chose to make. Now, is that a fair assessment? Do you think that really this is going to be a focal point when we remember Biden down the road?
No, I think that with the one possible exception being President Ford's pardoning of Richard Nixon, we don't remember who the president pardoned. I think that, for example, George H.W. Bush in his last days in office pardoned some people who were involved in the Iran-Contra affair, which George H.W. Bush was allegedly involved in. He pardoned those. When you think of George H.W. Bush, you do not think of that. Bill Clinton pardoned financier Mark Rich. He pardoned Susan McDougal, who was his business partner in the Whitewater episode. He pardoned his half brother Roger Clinton for past cocaine use, and that's really not anything that's going to be remembered. I think that when you say the word presidential pardon, Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon, he was 70% job approval rating, the fourth highest of any president at that time. The day he pardoned Richard Nixon, it went down to 48%, and he never quite recovered. Other than that, people tend to forget about presidential pardons. This will be a 3 or 4 day story, but it really will not have much. It will be very de minimis in terms of President Biden's legacy.
So, Rich, I know that you're not a legal analyst, but I want to put up a tweet from our friend here at Live Now from Fox, Megan Cuniff. Now, she's a legal affairs journalist, and I think it segues me to my next question that I'll have for you. But first, Megan's tweet says this: bold move from prosecutors here as they oppose dismissing Hunter Biden's Los Angeles federal tax crimes case, despite his father's sweeping presidential pardon, saying, quote, the defendant's motion should be denied since there is no binding authority on this court which requires dismissal. So it brings me to this, Rich. Let's get some background on presidential pardons. What does that pardon entail? And have they always been part of the presidential powers? What are the subsets, really, of a pardon?
Yeah, it really goes back to English law about mercy. And basically every president, with the exception of William Henry Harrison, was only in there for 31 days, and James Garfield was only in there for about 3/4 of a year, have issued some pardons. A lot of the times these are pardons that get very little news coverage. They're people who potentially had some sort of a minor offense. Sometimes they're former congressmen. Bill Clinton, for example, pardoned Mel Reynolds, who was a former congressman from Illinois, who was charged with statutory rape. So there are those types of pardons. Usually, it's the ones that we hear about are major pardons. And in history, Andrew Johnson, for example, on Christmas of 1868, pardoned former Confederates. Jimmy Carter pardoned those who had dodged the draft or who have gone to Canada during the Vietnam War, for example. Sometimes it might be for someone for drug offenses. Joe Biden, for example, pardoned people who had been arrested only for simply federal marijuana offenses. But this is something that is certainly it's an arrow the president has in his quiver. That they can do that. And so obviously he has what's called clemency. And in clemency is essentially like an umbrella term. And under there, one of the things they can do is they can issue a full and unconditional pardon. Sometimes it's even to somebody who would not necessarily be hospitable to you politically. For example, Warren G. Harding pardoned Eugene V. Debs. Harding was a conservative Republican president. He pardoned Eugene V. Debs, who was the socialist candidate, former five-time socialist candidate for president, the Socialist Party nominee, and because he had allegedly violated the Espionage Act during World War I by speaking out against the military draft. So sometimes it kind of has strange bedfellows, if you will. Donald Trump pardoned Rod Blagojevich. Trump was a Republican. Blagojevich was a Democrat. Blagojevich had been involved allegedly in trying to sell President Obama's Senate seat that he vacated in 2008 to become president. So sometimes it can kind of cross partisan lines, but most pardons are very small in terms of the attention they get in nature, and you really never hear of them, and sometimes they get absolutely a no set of news coverage.
You mentioned a little bit on the pardons on behalf of now President-elect Trump during his first presidency, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But let's kind of recap Biden and his time in the Oval Office. Who else has he pardoned, and why?
The main thing in terms of pardoning was that he pardoned, and this was a group pardon, was some people who had been involved in nonviolent marijuana possession offenses. He pardoned them, very similar to Andrew Johnson. You can pardon to a whole series of people. You don't have to individually, it's almost like a blanket pardon for people. You don't have to individually sign every single pardon. But that's what he's basically going to be known for in terms, if you look at his pardon. Other than that, it's a litany of people that really very few people have heard of, mostly private citizens.
So I know that you've also touched on, again, kind of throughout these answers, who the pardons have been within the Biden administration, the previous Trump administration. Let's kind of focus on that before we look ahead to 2025, because that's also making some headlines as we look to see who is going to be pardoned then. But let's go back to this 2016 term of then President Trump. So who did he pardon? What was his focus?
He pardoned many. Well, I was talking earlier about Rod Blagojevich. Rod Blagojevich is actually somebody that he had fired on Celebrity Apprentice, and then he landed up pardoning him. Rod Blagojevich was, if you remember, was the former governor of Illinois, and when Barack Obama was elected president in 2008, under Illinois law, the governor has plenary powers to appoint the successor. And there was later on a sting, and they found out that he had allegedly tried to sell for political influence that Senate seat. Donald Trump, he landed up actually going to federal prison, and his party, his family actually beseeched President Obama at the time to pardon Rod Blagojevich. President Obama did not do that. Donald Trump subsequently did, and Rod Blagojevich later said that he was very much a Democrat for Trump, but so he basically got out of prison. Others, Paul Manafort, who was his former campaign manager, he was pardoned, Roger Stone. So sometimes it's people who have been involved, if you will, with Donald Trump and kind of Donald Trump's coefficients in terms of getting him to the presidency. He can be very loyal sometimes to those people. He also pardoned others, for example, rapper Lil Wayne, for example, and a lot of people he pardoned, frankly, that we really have not heard of. But those are the ones that are kind of the top lines, if you will.
So, Rich, a name that has come up in the headlines now that we're kind of focused on these pardons, I want to put up a tweet here, courtesy of the New York Post. And here it kind of echoes that Trump has named his son-in-law Jared Kushner's father, Charles, as the next ambassador to France. So the background on this story, of course, is that Charles is someone who was pardoned by Trump during his time in office in 2020. Now, Charles was convicted of falsifying tax returns, witness tampering, and illegal campaign contributions. So have you seen other presidential pardons kind of rise through the ranks throughout history? Because we're talking about now that he has been appointed to be really one of the heads within the next Trump administration.
No, I really don't see much precedent for that. I guess theoretically, James K. Polk pardoned John C. Fremont. And John C. Fremont in 1856 became the first Republican presidential nominee, so he kind of rose to the ranks. But in terms of the actual president who pardoned the person, then giving that person a position in his administration, I really can't envisage that scenario in any other form.
All right, now let's look ahead then to the Trump presidency come 2025, because there's a lot of chatter as to who the president-elect will be pardoning then. He has said a few of those ideas that he has throughout this last election cycle. So really, let's recap for our viewers. Who's top of mind for Trump?
It's a very good question. And you have to remember, first of all, there are federal pardon, and there's also what the president cannot do is he cannot pardon somebody who's elected, who is convicted who is convicted of a non-federal crime. So somebody, for example, who's been indicted or convicted at the state level, he does not have that authority. Sometimes governors have that authority, but the president does not have that authority. But in terms of people who have been arrested, who have some sort of a stain on their marks, I think one you could say would probably be Stephen Bannon, for example, his former, really kind of his concierge, if you will, and kind of his main advisor, and really one of the people who got him to 2016 to the presidency. I guess you could theoretically say somebody like him, or, there are a lot of people that go from one administration to another and they keep on asking for a pardon. The president there's actually a process for this. The president just doesn't just go and start saying, I want to pardon this person. It's actually a pardoning attorney that works for the Justice Department, and that office recommends people. So I guess theoretically, yes, the president could sign a pardon for pretty much anybody convicted of a federal crime. But from a practical matter, if the president were to do the standard operating procedure, he would go through the pardoning attorney, and the pardoning attorney would recommend this person and that person. Now, that he could recommend not to pardon somebody, and the president certainly under those particular circumstances could override the pardoning attorney and could actually issue his own pardons.
Continuing on here with a live look out there at the White House as we are detailing all of this breaking news and also kind of trying to look ahead as to what we can expect. So, Rich, more of an open-ended question here. Can we get a sense as to where a president's priorities lie based on who they pardon?
Yes, absolutely. For example, Warren G. Harding, when he pardoned Eugene V. Debs was an opponent. Eugene V. Debs is somebody actually interesting. In 1920, Warren G. Harding was the Republican nominee. James Cox was the Democratic nominee. And running to the left wing of both of those was Eugene V. Debs, running as a Socialist Party nominee, actually literally running from a prison cell. His name was on the ballot, and he was running from a prison cell. Warren G. Harding pardoned him, even though politically they had very little in common. They were very much ideological opposites, but he still was able to pardon him. Bill Clinton, very interestingly, and here's a very interesting one. Fife Symington was the governor of Arizona. When Bill Clinton was a young man, he actually was swept out to sea by a riptide, and Symington went out and actually saved his life. This is a conservative Republican, future governor of Arizona. Bill Clinton becomes president January 20th of 2001. Bill Clinton gets him some reciprocity, I guess, and pardons him for certain offenses that he had. So sometimes it can be really interesting, but I think oftentimes it's somebody who's been very loyal to the person. Bill Clinton, for example, pardoned Susan McDougal. Susan McDougal was the partner involved in Whitewater. Eventually, she was arrested for contempt of Congress, and Bill Clinton was very much against Ken Starr, who was prosecuting the Whitewater affair, which eventually the trajectory led over to the Monica Lewinsky incident. But in his last day of office, he pardoned Monica Lewinsky. Interestingly, he did not pardon Webster Hubbell, who was also somewhat tangentially involved with Whitewater, or his successor, first governor of Arkansas, Jim Guy Tucker. But he did pardon Susan McDougal. In Donald Trump's case, I think you see in many respects that he tends to pardon people who have been very loyal to him. if you're very loyal to Donald Trump and you kind of got him to the dance, if you got him to the presidency, he will sometimes reply in kind and will pardon that person.
You know, Rich, my final question was going to be what are some of the most maybe controversial pardons throughout U.S. history? But I feel like we've touched on a lot here. So instead, I'll segue and just ask you, what do you really have your eye on going forward, maybe mostly in regards to these presidential pardons? Is this the last one we're going to see from Biden?
No, my guess is he will probably pardon a series of people on the last day or the next to last day in office. The preponderance of those people are probably going to people that you'll say, I've never heard of that person. Probably somebody convicted of a low-level drug offense, for example, or somebody that's been convicted of something in a law that's convicted a series of years ago, something to that effect. Will he pardon any actual politicians? I don't know. There are certainly politicians that have been convicted, maybe people that he's known in the past, but there's a pardoning attorney. There is a process for this. He does not just do it arbitrarily and capriciously. I like this person, so we can do it that way. But for the most part, there is a process for this entire thing to happen, and there are a lot of people who will go through the pardoning process. This is their last resort. They've tried everything else. They say, please, 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 Mr. President, this is my last resort. And oftentimes you saw this Bill Clinton on his last 2 days in office pardoned everyone from Patty Hearst to former Congressman Dan Rostenkowski of Illinois, to former Congressman Mel Reynolds of Illinois, and to Fife Symington, to Susan McDougal. So it can really be kind of a hodgepodge, if you will, of people who have been convicted who believe that they have been somehow wronged or somehow are asking to be absolved in the pardon process.
All right, well, we'll just have to wait and see then. Rich Rubino, political analyst and historian, always a pleasure to have you here at Live Now from Fox to help break down all of these top political headlines. Take care.
Thank you so much for having me on again.